Hello everyone, and welcome to this Rainerit webinar on visitor studies in the digital age. This webinar is part of a series of webinars developed within the Horizon project Rainerit, and you will be able to find news about upcoming webinars on our hub, and the registration of the webinar themselves with the slides afterwards. And in the chat, you will find the link to the Rainerit hub in a few minutes. I am Chiara Zuanni, and today I'm talking about visitor studies in the digital age, understanding digital audience engagement. To say something about myself first, I come from the University of Graz in Austria, where I'm based in the Center for Information Modeling, Austrian Center for Digital Humanities. My background is in archaeology and in museology. I have a PhD in museum studies that I will partially mention later on in this presentation. And I'm currently an assistant professor in digital humanities with a focus on digital heritage and digital museology. My work therefore spans from the production of digital records and digital informations on museum objects or cultural heritage objects, digital reproduction in 2D and 3D, or different ways of dealing with heritage imaging, working with this data to research digital heritage questions of provenance, for example, or about the histories of museum collections, digital engagement production, so production of small interactives to engage with the public in museums and exhibitions, and ultimately digital audience research, which is the topic of today, and it is actually one of the topics in which I'm personally most interested in. Today, I will begin by first talking briefly about the context of visitor studies. I'm not aware of all of your background, so I will just give you a very short summary of the context and history of traditional visitor studies in museums, and then I will try to move towards digital audience research. I will briefly talk about evaluating in-gallery digital engagements and ways we can do so, drawing on traditional methods combined with more innovative methodologies. And then the second part of my talk, and probably the longest part, will be about evaluating online engagement. And in this section, I will begin by talking first about quantitative methods, such as analytics, that we can very easily set up in any online platform. Two qualitative methods, which are a first step towards getting a bit of a more granular understanding of our audiences, but without the need of advanced digital skills. And subsequently, I will move back to talk about other quantitative methods, in this case, more complicated one, perhaps data science driven, that allows us to do longer and more in-depth analysis of our audiences. And partially towards the end of my talk, but mainly in the slides that you will be able to find online afterwards, I will add links to projects and resources in case you want to delve more into this topic and have a deeper look at some of the issues I mentioned. You are always welcome also to type questions in the chat, which I'm seeing, and I will try to answer to all of these questions during the webinars. To begin with, as I said, I will begin with a very quick snapshot of visitor studies, which have a pretty long history in museums. Visitor studies, as a way of counting visitors entering through the museum doors, actually started very early, already in the late Renaissance, in the natural history collections of Bologna, for example, where Aldovrandi started to take notes of the numbers of visitors entering into its botanical collections and gardens. That became kind of a praxis in the 19th centuries, where museums started to count the visitors entering the door. In some cases, for example, in Victorian England, they would also count the type of visitors divided by social class, so whether it was an educated woman versus a worker class person, and so on. But these were all very quantitative studies, which led to little insights into the experience and ideas of the visitors. In the early 20th centuries, there was more attention to that. There was, in the 1930s, a few interesting studies trying to go beyond this merely counting the visitor perspective. But we can say that regular surveys of museums visitors with more questions about where did they come from, their level of education, their backgrounds, their interest for the topic started later on in the second part of the 20th century. Visitor survey become pretty used in museums in the 1960s. And actually, a famous visitor survey was the background of a famous test in museum studies. Bourdieu and Darbel drew on a survey of visitors in different Central European countries when they published L'amour de l'art in France in 1969, and then translated later on in English, in which they made the classical argument that museums were talking only to a certain type of visitors, that is educated middle-aged men. Since the 90s, with the new museologies, there was a new attention to the adoption of social sciences methods to understand the experiences of museum visitors. At the same time, during the 90s, we also witnessed his work, for example, such as that from Aina, connecting learning theories with museum experiences, and in doing so, criticizing the prevailing quantitative approach in visitor research, and arguing for this more qualitative understanding of visitor experiences and visitors' construction of meanings in museums. The key argument there is that we cannot really quantify how much a visitor learns in museums. We cannot quantify their experience only in numbers. We need to have a really qualitative and granular understanding of their experience as a whole. And this draws on the idea that museums actually are not only places for learning. As Super Grenil wrote in 1999 in this quote, which I like a lot, museums are really no better at imparting information than other places. We cannot quantify the benefit of going to a museum by thinking how much someone has learned about a new topic. But they are instead very good at giving people an experience of a real thing, such that a desire to know more ensues. So a museum experience is valued in that it increases the motivation to learn, it enables people to discover new passions and new interests, and it enables people to connect with this new knowledge. And then eventually visitors will go out and make something more of this new knowledge, follow these passions, read more on the topic. But it's the sparkling of this connection that interests us in museums. And this is very difficult to quantify. As a consequence, as I said, during the 90s, museums adopted a lot of frameworks from social sciences and learning theorists to try to understand other ways of framing visitor experience. A framework that I will talk about in the next slides was developed by Volk and Dierking since the beginning of the 90s till the 2010s, when the last books have come out by these authors, and draws on three key aspects that make up the museum experience. This contextual model by Volk and Dierking is personally one that I find very useful also for thinking about digital engagement in the galleries, and that is why I'm talking about it today and I'm emphasizing it. For Volk and Dierking, the museum experience is based on the coming together of three different contexts. On the one hand, the physical context, which is the design and presentation that we find in a museum exhibition. This could go from the way the panels are located, the typography of the panels, the lights on the objects, so to say, really the physical design of a museum exhibition. The social context is the second context that is important in a museum experience, and it deals with issues of social mediation, with the way that museum staff can interact with the visitors, making the experience more or less pleasant, the way that other visitors are navigating the same rooms, and this could go from considering a room as very crowded and to kind of slowing down the visit, or perhaps annoying visitors because of a lot of people around shouting or taking photos or moving in the corridor and kind of blocking the view. to, vice versa, a room quieter with a different group of visitors that make a visit more pleasant. The social context can be also the same context of a visitor himself or herself, such as, for example, a parent visiting with children, which will have undoubtedly a pretty different experience from a young couple or a group of friends. And then we have the personal context, which is the visitor himself, his or previous experiences, prior knowledge of the topic and interest, the motivation and attitude also on the day, and the background. So overall, I could be a very tired visitor who is going into the museums out of professional interest, but has less energy and just want to see the exhibition and get out quickly. Or I could be relaxed, have a lot of time, don't have any kind of pressure, and enjoy the exhibition at a more leisurely pace. And that's basically what makes up the personal context. These three contexts together form the museum experience. And this is unique to each museum visit. So every time I visit a museum, I might always be the same person, but I might be forming my experience at this slightly different configuration of these three contexts, and this will affect my overall impression of the visit. Over time, these repeated museum visits, one time I'm tired, one time I'm fully relaxed, one time I'm visiting with children, one time I'm visiting with my best friend, one time the exhibition is crowded, or one time there is a lot of panels with a lot of text. Every time I have a different experience, and over time, this repeated visit led me to what Volker Dierking called the contextual model of learning first, and then referred to as the identity of a museum experience. Here, perhaps in these slides, we can still find in the center these three contexts: personal, physical, and sociocultural context. And we can see that every time a visitor entering the museums from here, it has some sort of baggage, so to say, my personal identity and my perception of museum affordances that kind of led me to enter through the door and visit the exhibitions. Going through the exhibition, I will have my experience based on the intersection of these frameworks, and in turn, this will afterwards affect reinforcing or changing my perception of museum affordances and my identity as a museum visitor. Overall, it might be, if I start having a few too many negative experiences, I might change my perception of museums, and I might need a bit more convincing to enter through the door next time. Otherwise, if it's always a positive experience, this sense of me as someone who gets satisfaction and positive feedback from going into a museum will get reinforced, and it will be easier for me to enter. And that's basically the idea of the three contexts intersecting during a museum visit. I just want to very quickly go back to these slides to reflect on how this can be applied also to the digital world. Because I can think of museum applications and a museum guide on a smartphone, a touch screen interactive or an augmented reality application, for example, in a museum. And this will still be some kind of interactive method during the museum experience that can be fitted to this context. So that, for example, if we consider a touch screen, we can consider the physical context of a touch screen, where it is in the gallery. So if it is in a place where it slows down visitors and kind of everyone gets stuck in front of a screen, or if it kind of facilitates the flow of visitors being more on the margin of the room, if it works in an easy way or not. So we all know that touchscreens sometimes can get problematic, and that can be an aspect to be considered in this physical context. It can be, I can apply that also to social context. if I'm visiting alone or in a group, I might have different possibilities and different also chances of looking at my phone or looking at the touch screen, because being with other people, I might get distracted. If I think of other forms of digital interactive in galleries, such as virtual reality, for example, which completely abstract me from my reality, it completely put me in another immersive reality. That is something that is pleasant if I'm alone, but it's something that is very difficult to share with friends. And especially if I'm a parent with young children, I might not be able to put on a virtual reality headset and be completely abstracted from my surrounding, because I need to look after my children, so to say. And at the same time, another argument for digital application in the gallery is the way they can offer us different narrative of a museum exhibitions, and in this way perhaps cater to some of my interests, so to sort of enhance my personal context, enhance my interest for this topic by giving me the possibility to learning something that is not fitting on a museum panel itself. But going back to visitors research, the next questions I want to briefly discuss is how can we actually figure out all of this when we are doing a visitor study in a museum gallery? Because so far I've talked very much in a theoretical way. In this case, there are the traditional visitor studies methods. I'm sure you're all familiar with some of these, from the questionnaires that can be asked at the end of a museum visit, to unobtrusive or participant observations, interviews and focus groups, or eye tracking and maps, which are two interesting methods as well. Eye tracking is something I won't talk too much in depth about, because it requires the acquisition of specialized equipment and software, but it's a method of applying a small camera on a pair of glasses on the visitor, so that it is possible to see what the visitor is observing during the museum visit. It almost becomes something that the visitor doesn't notice. It's like having on a pair of glasses, and after the first minutes, the visitors might forget about it, going around, looking at things, and we can see through the registration on this camera what the visitor is looking at, and evaluate which are the points of attention or not in the gallery. But this requires having the equipment and setting it up. Maps is something I will instead show to you in a minute, because it's something that I find as a cheap and very interesting method that can be applied to understand the impact both of a traditional museum visit or of any kind of digital applications in the galleries. I will do so by talking about a case study from my PhD research, which finished a few years ago in 2015, and it was based in Manchester. I was a student at the University of Manchester, and I looked at the presentation of archaeology in the Manchester Museum and the public perception of archaeology and its impact on the museum visit. By this, I mean that I was interested in seeing what visitors expect from an archaeological exhibition, given that archaeology is a subject that is not usually studied at school, but is very fascinating for a lot of people. We have a lot of representation of archaeology in the public sphere, from Indiana Jones to video games. And so my question was like, how do all this fascination, public fascination for archaeology, or this set of representations affect a museum visit? At the time, I did my research in the Manchester Museum, so I studied their exhibitions, doing archival research, interviews with curators, and so on. I also did some of the traditional, used some of the methods I mentioned above, such as unobtrusive observations. This was basically me sitting in a corner of the room, of the 3 rooms that constitute the archaeological exhibitions in the museums, and tracing the paths of visitors, so that I ended up with these sketches of the rooms and the museum cases, and I was just observing which routes the visitors took across it. For example, we can see that in the case of this big rectangular case, there were a lot of visitors that were going through the central corridor, coming back until here, and then going back to the next room. So here there was really something that made them turn away and continuing their visit rather than going all across the case in itself. And that's something that I could then look at what objects were there, why this became a point of interest for some of the visitors, and that was due to a combination of the way the panels were in the exhibition and the type of object that prompted more or less interest. I did the traditional interviews and so on, but I also used maps. And this is what I want to briefly show you because I find it very interesting. By maps, it basically means that at the very end of a visit, I was asking some visitors, instead of standard questions through a survey, to sketch a drawing of the galleries they had just seen. So it was, you had just finished visiting this exhibition. Can you please just sketch out on these block notes what have you seen, and maybe notate some of the objects that were most interesting or the ones that you remember. Just by asking that, I could see that the visitor on the exit door of the exhibition had forgot a lot of what was before, or had already started to remember things in a slightly different way. So the kind of preconception about museums and their expectations were already kind of showing off in the way they drew these maps. And that was at a macro level and interesting for me for research purposes. Interesting in terms of evaluating the exhibition itself was how they defined the objects. So, for example, this is a famous exhibit in the Manchester Museums with a lot of Shaptis. There is next to that an interactive that explains what is a Shapti. There is an hands-on stations for children to play with a Shapti and all the explanations about these Egyptian objects. But still, these visitors defined it as massive, tiny mummies. So not only the word Shapti had gone out, but also the fact that those were statuettes were kind of forgotten, and it's more the shape of the statuette as that of a mummy that had kind of remained in the memory of these visitors. In other cases, combining interviews with maps, I could see objects such as this, which are from early Roman Britain, that were compared through the frame of identities to traditional motifs in other parts of the world. So I could start of seeing how the visitors were comparing and relating the objects to their own backgrounds. This is an example of analog observations, but the same could be done with an application. I had also in this context visitors using the museum applications to navigate the exhibition. And I was again listening in some cases when I had their permission, or asking questions afterwards about the use of applications. And I could already see how they were using the information from the applications combined with their backgrounds to make sense of their visiting experience. This is a very qualitative method that takes a lot of time, so it's certainly possible and interesting, but I could do it because I was a PhD researcher doing a full thesis on the topic. It can be done in some cases in specific research projects. It's a bit more difficult to do it on a regular basis for a museum. So in this case, we can use things as audience segmentation practices that can be used for funding purposes. So in this case, I copy in the DCMS, which is the English Department for Culture, Media and Sport, performance indicator guidance for museum and galleries, in which they list already some of the categories they want to have data about for museum audiences, and they link funding to this data. But if we look at it at a macro level, audience segmentation is this process of dividing people into groups depending on set characteristics, which could be demographics, cultural habits, motivation to visit, geographical provenance, and so on. It can be very simple. So this is a very early classification for studying Italian audiences developed by Alessandro Boll in 2016, in which we see the non-public, so people who don't visit museums or will never go, and the potential public of museums, including the core audiences, those that will go to every single exhibition because they are very passionate about the museums. Occasional audiences, those that will show up every now and then when they are prompted in their curiosity enough. And potential audiences, so people who could go to museums, would be interested into it, but are not really showing up as much as they could, and so they could be reached by marketing campaign and so on. If this is a simpler framework, here just a comparison. I show two of the big framework most common for this type of studies in the English words. One is the audience spectrum profile by the Audience Agency, and the other one is the culture segments by Morris, Hargreaves, and McIntyre. Both of the Audience Agency and Morris, Hargreaves, and McIntyre are companies that support museums in conducting these studies. And they have developed profiles that can be ascribed to a user after looking at the responses of a questionnaires. And as we can see from some of the description, are quite abstract at first look, but then through their studies, they have linked this type of profile to patterns in cultural consumption. So that this is a percentage of how much people would be spending on arts and cultural participation in cultural events, and their average frequency of arts attendance in a year. So basically, based on this type of profile, abstract profile linked to, let's say, almost psychological characteristics, they can estimate a pattern of consumption for museums. So by participating, by collaborating with this type of agency, they can offer benchmarks with other visitors and saying that visitors who tend to answer in this way to our questionnaires tend to go to a museums a lot, tend to spend a lot on culture or not, and can help setting up evaluations. This is very quantitative. There are other frameworks that are more theoretical. I already mentioned quite a lot on that, so I will be very quick. I just point out this report by the University of Leicester in 2016 on the social and cultural values of museums, in which a taxonomy of user experience in museums and galleries was developed for understanding the experience from a more qualitative and granular perspective. On the other hand, there are plenty of studies done in museums for very specific targets that we can look at. And again, I will have some example in my literature at the end of these presentations. I've already tried to mention in relation to the Folk and Dirking example how this can be applied to digital engagement. But one of the big challenges we face still in digital engagement is the lack of such benchmark and such clear framework for evaluating experience. So this type of framework, such as that by the Audience Agency of Morris, Hargreaves, and McIntyre, are targeted at audience in the gallery, participating in a cultural event or visiting an exhibition. They are not specifically adapted to the digital aspect. There has been some work in this direction during COVID because this has become important for everyone, but there is still a clear lack of segmentation in these directions. What we can do is using these theoretical frameworks and these ideas I've been talking about that are used for traditional audiences for understanding digital engagement in the galleries. So again, considering these frameworks by Folk and Dirking, considering how an app enable a new audience segment to engage in a different way with an artworks or to facilitate their experience so that it makes it easier and it makes more possible for them to enjoy the experience and come back in a museum. But we still have to fully understand the consequences of that. And there is a lot of research on the, let's say, theoretical side. There are less clear guidelines for museums in evaluating their applications. I use this photo that maybe you have seen around, because it's a very famous photo that was posted on social media in the Rijksmuseum, on social media from these children in the Rijksmuseums a few years ago in 2014. But it kind of symbolizes part of the questions that we still have open. In this case, it was a visitor to the Rijksmuseums that posted the photo with a bit of a shock that children were looking at their phone rather than looking at the masterpiece by Rembrandt behind them. It prompted some debate on Twitter at the time, and as a consequence, the teacher of this school group intervened in the debate and pointed out that the children were looking at the Rijksmuseum application. This is a more recent screenshot of it, to find more information about the painting itself. So they had some kind of homework about finding out details about the painting, and they were using the guide included in the museum applications to find this type of information. Still, we see the risk and the debate that there was 9 years ago about application distracting from the real masterpiece. This debate is somehow still here, but what is most important is really what is, rather than the distraction that can be a mobile phone, it is the value that we can give to the digital application in adding something to the experience. So personally, I think that we are used to multitask in a way right now. The digital engagement application is always welcome to show a different aspect of the artwork. What is really the challenge is understanding what any kind of digital activity is adding in value to the museum experience. So to help us produce digital applications that are sustainable in the long term, because they have visitors that are interested in them, that use them, so that there is a clear return on our investment to produce these applications, and we can use them. In this case, we can again use similar methods to those I used before. We can target our surveys to understand the user experience of the application. So we can look at user experience questionnaires. There are a lot of those available online for web developers and app developers, and consider how they can be applied to our applications. And we can look also at analytics. So embed analytics within the application and monitor its use. And this is the second part of my talks, in which I move on now to talk about what happens when we look only at the data, when we don't have the possibility to interact with visitors in the museum gallery, and we rely on any kind of data we can gather from our digital applications of our websites. And so I consider now what happens when we don't have this direct contact with the audience and they are online, detached from us, and we want to try to understand the success of a digital project or initiative. The first thing we can always look at are analytics. In this case, most websites will come with embedded analytics. For example, WordPress has its own analytics, but we can also consider a platform such as Google Analytics and customize it for our needs. This is a screenshot from Google Analytics, in which from a website I manage, in which we can see that the numbers of users that are joining into, are visiting a platforms, the number of sessions, which is bigger because some users might have come back or not, as we see from here. We can see how much generally they stay on the website. In the case of this website that I'm showing you, very little, because the website has actually only 2 pages. It's a simple questionnaire online, but I can still monitor if I see more than 1 page, if I go to the second views, and I can see page views as well. So by looking into Google Analytics platforms and customizing its reports and so on, we can start to evaluate different ways of just monitor participation in our websites and set up a specific report, for example, for specific subpages in our website so to monitor, for example, clicks on a specific link, if this is what we are interested in. In this case, there are, again, not a lot of benchmarks, but there are some comparison we can do with museums that shares their dashboards. The Smithsonian is, of course, immense and very big, and most museums will not be able to compare with it, just because of how big organizationally the Smithsonian is, and how many websites it hosts. But they share regularly snapshots of their public engagements, including the number of website visitors and social media engagement. This could be most interesting to see what type of things they count. So it's not about the number itself, because the Smithsonian is too big as a museum in comparison to most museums, but it's about what they are counting and the way they are sharing this data, which could become interesting for us. And on museum analytics, here I share also some resources to other presentations by colleagues, which are particularly interesting. We can do the same things for social media. All social media platforms comes with analytics embedded. This is the landing page for Twitter analytics, for example, in which we see that for every month there is a short snapshot showing which is the top tweet, so the one that got most likes, the follower which has most followers themselves, and this is why, because it's called top followers, is the one which brings more people in its own networks, and same thing for mentions. And what's interesting to notice in this case, and why I have these slides, is the difference between impressions and all the other values. That's because profile visits means someone really went on the profile of the user, in this case is my own account, and checked out who I am. Mentions, they mentioned me in something, they tagged me in some content, but impression is just a number that is completely out of proportion here. And we start to see why a bit more in these slides. It is again from Twitter Analytics, from one of the pages in which precise detail for each tweets are given. Impressions it basically means everyone who could potentially have seen my tweet, whereas engagement, such as mentions, retweets, likes, replies, and so on, are people who actually engaged with it. These two numbers are always very different, because potentially anyone who follows me could have seen my own tweet, but also anyone, if my tweet has been shared, anyone who follows whoever retweeted me could have seen the tweet. But the could is the important keywords. They might have just been scrolling through their timeline, and we all know that when we're scrolling quickly, we don't really see and look at the content of a social media post. Engagement is where someone really stops, likes, retweet, replies, so in a way demonstrate attention to what I've posted. And this type of difference is in all social media platforms, and is very important to consider when we look at these analytics. Impressions will always be a bigger number and a nicer one, but at the end of the day, engagement is what's most interesting for us, because it demonstrates attention by the other users for our content. On Facebook, and instead of impressions, they use the word reach. So if you manage a Facebook page, you will have a kind of a page called Insights within your page manager's part of Facebook. And in the Insights, you find the reach of your page. That's exactly the same thing as impressions. So people who potentially might have seen your post, and then you have the actually likes, comments, and so on. So people who actually engaged with that content, which is what is most interesting for us. Another way when we share links to kind of measure them is to use Bitly. And in this case, we also get analytics. So I'm just sharing it as a way of considering how to enhance our analytics behind the platform. By using links shorteners, we can go through the link shortener platform, in this case the Bitly platforms, and see how many people have clicked on it, and some basic data on where did they find the shortener, if they got it via email or Twitter, and where those people located. In short, all these analytics within a website or a platforms allows us to grasp the success in numerical terms of our initiative, and that's about it. It's very difficult to say we have had 400 people clicking on our link. What happened afterwards? Were they interested? What's going on there? And that is what we really don't know, and why it becomes difficult for us to do more research on our audiences besides saying they liked it. In this case, as above, we don't have clear benchmarks. I'm sorry, I'm repeating it a lot today, but there is a lot of research that has been ongoing in this sector in the last 10 years because we all understood that there is a need of understand better digital visitors. I like this quote because by Nesta and Arts Council England, because that's their annual report that they published in December 2019, in which they said that it is becoming essential to understand how to gather, analyze, and interpret audience data, so to develop effective audience engagement strategies. And indeed, as we have seen, we have all this type of informations. This is the Leicester report again for physical visitors to evaluate their engagement with a normal exhibition. We don't have this type of granularity for digital visitors. And the fact that they published that just before we all moved online with the pandemic in 2020, and this need became even more evident to everyone, is particularly kind of ironic and interesting for me. As I mentioned, it's 10 years, it's 10, 15 years that there are projects trying to gauge the engagement of digital audiences, and in particular in relation to social media, which is what I will talk most about now. But there are not yet clear solutions. On the one hand, there is the traditional work of the social media manager, of website managers, in which an identity is established for the social media channel, an audience is targeted, and consequently platforms are chosen or not. So for example, when choosing teenagers, one will go on TikTok right now. When choosing people over 30, perhaps on Facebook, and so on. There is all the work of planning the content, thinking about how to prepare posts, which type of photos, which type of text, which tone and writing style to use. There is the work of planning how to answer to comments and doing it, reacting to any kind of questions we could get through the social media platforms. There might be crisis moments in which we need to react quickly and in a transparent way to any kind of problems that could arise from social media. And then there is the work of evaluating all of that, so to improve the strategy. And these evaluations is done so far mostly by going through analytics and the personal, so to say, experience of the social media managers, who will be aware of the type of comments they are receiving and will be able to react more or less quickly. At the same time, I mentioned experience of the social media managers because this can change a lot. So usually when a museum first joins social media, the first step usually is to broadcast informations. So just sharing a lot of news, disseminating a lot of informations, but not explicitly calling upon the audience to interact with. In some cases, there are big events in which we can encourage everyone to share content. And then there are cases which could be more or less moments of crisis for the social media managers, in which visitors start to post about the museums independently, not only the photos of a museum visit, but also, for example, polemic content or just viral post about some kind of event or objects. And these are difficult to manage from the social media manager, but it's where the thing will get interested for the researchers, because we have a lot of data from the audience that we can evaluate. So if we want to study this situation going beyond analytics, we have two ways. I've kind of mentioned them already a bit in a cryptic way, so I have them clearly in these slides. On the one hand, we can go qualitative and conduct digital ethnography studies. This will take a bit more time, but they don't require too much programming skills. It's really more about adopting ethnographic methods in the digital realm, so that we can observe the participation on websites or on platforms, the intervention and comments by the users. We can do interviews through the social media platforms. For example, if we are studying the success of our Facebook page, we could send the interview via Facebook Messenger to some users. And we can kind of study the experience of the visitors. In this way, we can have in-depth qualitative data about few selected users. The other way, which is the more complicated one, probably from a digital perspective, is data science methods. Those allows us to gather a lot of data about our audience, analyze patterns, analyze phenomena, but they require a certain knowledge of social media platforms, how they work, and programming languages. In this case, I just show you a quick example, again, from the Manchester Museum, but so to keep the consistency with the theme and the example I had before, of when I started to do this type of studies. This was 2013, so 10 years ago, when and the Manchester Museum posted a video online in which there was a statuette, this one, that was moving on its own in the case. They had set up a time lapse in the museum case, and we could see this statuette kind of turning on itself without any apparent reason. And the video was posted saying, there is this mystery, we are not sure what's happening. At the time, I was doing the PhD, so I started immediately to collect data, and I ended up with this type of data about people talking about the statuette and why is it moving. And you can see from the numbers that it is a lot of data to analyze individually, but they are also very diverse and covering a lot of space geographically and so on, all concentrated in a weekend. In this case, I decided to go mostly with a digital ethnography approach. So I actually looked at the data very closely to understand the differences. What's interesting here about the digital ethnography approach is that I really followed the links shared in the tweets, for example, across different platforms. So to end up with a very diverse collections, which allows me to see differences in content. For example, if I look at the readership of a newspapers, or better of a tabloid like the Daily Mail, I can see that this news title reporting on the history of this statuette and pretty mistaken from an archaeological and museological perspective. Let's say that I don't really agree with most of what is in the title. But I was looking, it plays on a lot of perception of archaeology. Let's see how many people read it and got this version of a story. If I had looked only at Twitter, I would have thought that only few people had read it. And so I would have been, this is just an article for a small groups of people. It doesn't influence the debate. No one believes that there is a curse of the pharaohs. Instead, following the link, I looked also at the article itself and the comment below it, and we can see the number is way bigger. So in a way, this has become for me a tale in how to remember to always check different platforms, because they all have different audiences, which will react differently. Different online communities usually might kind of cluster or create their own bubbles in different areas of the internet. And to get a snapshot across all of these gives us much more richer information about the overall receptions of an event. From a methodological standpoint, then in this case, I just did a thematic analysis, which means I looked at all the various Twitter and posts and looked how people have been talking about the event through keywords. So for example, in these slides, you see reference to popular culture, So people saying there is a statuette moving on its own in a museum. Let's call Indiana Jones. It is the mummy. It is night at the museums, or other less expected, perhaps, references. But in a way, I could still look at all this content individually. Since then, I've been using these methods, combining data science methods and this more qualitative aspect to look at different events and facts in museums, and to try to answer questions such as how can we understand participations on social media? How can we use social media data for an objective audience evaluation, especially given this difference in audiences across different channels and platforms? And I kind of developed further my research using also data science methods. So for showing you a quick example of data science, I show you this collection of data from Museum Week in 2016, in which it seemed that Italians had been posting a lot. If we look at all the tweets from that Museum Weeks and every single day, we see that the language code for Italy, is extremely high in comparison to all other languages for the number of tweets, not so far off for the number of users, the orange column. And at the time, I was intrigued by asking why so many tweets from Italy? What's going on there? Is it participation really increased in comparison to other countries? And so I gathered the publicly available information on every profile that tweeted, in this case using R, which is a statistic language, to mine the platforms, so that I could kind of gather information on people who belonged to the cultural heritage sector, the orange one, and didn't, the blue ones. And at the end, I could combine the information on people from a cultural sector and people not from the cultural sector with the content of their tweets, tagged by category, as I did in the case of a spinning statuette. So in this case, my category were like Museum Week, marketing, talking about the museum itself, and so on. And by combining the two, I could observe like pattern of communications between people in the museum sector, in the heritage sectors, where the majority of content was actually what I had tagged as socializing. So people networking really. And I could see that when I wrote the article months later, I could see that there was a follow-up on this networking, because there were workshops that were organized by people that at first got in touch during Museum Weeks on Twitter, and by the public, in which there was still a lot of networking, but also a lot of talking about the museums and its objects. So I could still say people still had a good understanding of what it means Museum Week and what's expected from them, even if they are less present, for example. In this case, as I mentioned, I used also R, which is a data science method, a better statistical language adapted for data science research, to mine the Twitter API. I have now a bunch of slides, only 3 or 4 slides, which are a bit more technical, just to give an overview of what are the challenges in this case and the construction of social media data. In this case, when I use a social media platform, so I am the subject, I use it through the browser or through the application on my phone, which as a way of communicating with the database, the content of all users and all posts of the platforms. And that way of communicating is the API. The API is basically the application programming interface, which allows this kind of communication, entry and exit of data from the full database of the social media applications to whatever is on my phone. And for me, as a social media user, it is translated in a nice interface that I can navigate through my web browsers and my phone application. When I'm doing research, I usually get the data in a format called JSON, but that's less important for today. I just wanted to mention it for giving you the full information on that. But basically, the API has 2 key ways of functioning. On the one end, the get mode, which is basically getting data. So it is when I'm looking at a social media feed, when I'm scrolling through my Instagram feed or my Facebook feed, I see all the posts from pages, friends I follow, or publicity that is popping up. This is basically a GET call that my phone application gives to the platforms. It basically tells the platforms, Chiara is currently looking at her feed. Let's give her data. Let's show her the content from her friends and pages, and I will see it. Vice versa, when I'm posting, I make a post call to the API. I basically, my phone say to the API, Chiara is trying to post something on these platforms. Let her go through. In this way, the APIs basically works as the entry point to the platform, and this is what we can operate on when we are using data science methods to study a social media set of data. This graph is very complicated, but let's start first on the first line, which is exactly what I had in the previous slides. Here I am with my phone or my web browsers posting something on Twitter. It ends up in the Twitter database. As a researcher, I am completely outside of the situations, and I want to study social media users. I can observe him with qualitative methods, ask questions, and so on. And this will be what we call the digital ethnography. So it will be another arrow here that I haven't in this graph to avoid making it more complicated. But it's just observations from outside. If I want to collect the data instead, I have two main ways. The best way usually is to get the data through the API. So I basically send a GET call to the API, give me data, I want the data, let's get them. And I can do it directly using Python or R as programming languages, or sometimes using tools that make it easier. In the case of Twitter, tags was working perfectly until a couple of months ago. Now it's a bit more problematic because of changes to the Twitter infrastructure, but it made it possible without the need of being able to code. But otherwise, I'm just getting data this way. The alternative is to scrape the data, so to just getting them from the platform themselves. In this case, I end up with a set of data, my data set, which I can analyze. And that's the last part I want to emphasize today, that these methods allows getting more data without interacting with the users. We can get a lot of data very quickly by using this type of data-intensive methods. But the data set I'm analyzing at the end is always partial, because I cannot get the full of Twitter, the full of Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. I will always get a partial data set, which has some bias. It is limited demographically, because first of all, every platform has a different API, so I need to change the code I'm using for every platform I'm studying. And this, therefore, my data set depends on the platform I've been looking at. If I get TikTok, I will get very different type of content than if I'm looking at Facebook. And so I need to be very careful in generalizing this type of engagement. The data is also never complete, because I get the data that the API allows me to grab in the moment in which I am performing my search. And this could be changing shorter after. And sometimes I don't even know why I get some data only, because the platforms are black boxes. It means I don't know fully everything about their code. And so I cannot really reconstruct why I got 10 photos from user A and 2 photos from user B. If it is because they really posted a different number of photos, because they have different privacy settings, because they have the platform just decided that I've reached my API call limit. It means it allows me only to get a certain number of data per time, and they decided they wouldn't give me more data in that call. And so I ended up only with this bunch of data. And then those data will have complex structures that will be a set of tables and nested tables that I need to be able to work on with R or Python mainly. So this type of languages that are used for this type of data science research. For us as museums, it means that it's really difficult to do this research on our own. We usually need to collaborate with specialists in data sciences or researchers at universities. And we need to have a clear research question and objectives, because collecting data from social media, we can end up with a lot of different data, and we need to know what we want to ask to our data sets, because if we let us being guided by whatever data we get from the platforms, we will always have some kind of sample with some bias and with some kind of limitations that allows us to ask lots of different questions, but not all of them might be relevant or interesting for us. So we need to get in with questions such as how many visitors took photos of these exhibitions? What are the most frequent comments visitors make about my exhibition? Did the visitors overall posted positively or negatively about the exhibition? And so on and so on. And then the data science specialists or the researchers can help in setting up the code that help finding the type of answers we want. In general, something very important to remember is that each platform has very different conditions of use and application programming interfaces. So here I have only Twitter, Facebook, and Instagrams, but we could add also TikTok, YouTube, or anything else. The application programming interfaces, so that way of getting the code, tend to change between them. So we need to be up to date with the code. But it also has terms and conditions for using it that can also change. For example, Instagram was very easy to search in the past, and then it gradually closed down and restricted access to researchers, or explicitly prohibited mining the data through the API for a certain amount of data or for big data sets. And so we need to be aware of these legal constraints. And the legal aspect to consider are the terms and conditions, the national legislations. I'm based in Austria, so I respond to Austrian legislation on copyright and data protections, but this might be different in your countries. The general data protection regulation from the EU, because the moment we start to look at social media, we're dealing with personal data by users, and we need to be very aware of how this could be studied and researched according to EU legislations. And ultimately also ethics, because as researchers and museum professionals, we have an ethics duty to our users in safeguarding their data and information. So we need to be very aware and set up clear guidelines for whoever does this research before starting. That's just a short summary, but of social media research in the data-driven aspects of it, and I would be happy to answer any mail you have afterwards or question here in the chat. But to conclude for today, I've tried to summarize the situation of traditional visitor studies methods, because I think that all this type of research still give us a lot of insights about museum visitors that can be applied or transferred to a certain extent to digital visitors and in gallery engagement. In particularly, the methods, as I showed, can be applied to study the success of an application in the museum galleries. When we move online, analytics are the easiest way to grab data about the success of an initiative, and they offer very useful snapshots about our audiences, but they lack perhaps of some kind of details that sometimes we would want, so to have a more granular understanding and a more qualitative understanding of why digital audiences appreciate certain aspects, certain type of projects more than others. In this case, digital ethnographies is an easy solution that doesn't require coding. It's a set of qualitative methods that we can adopt to observe online users' experiences. And conversely, data science methods allows us to grab a lot more data and observe a lot more users in a quick way. They are sometimes quicker than digital ethnographies, but those data comes with a lot of conditions and limitations that we need to be aware of. And these limitations are, first of all, legal and ethics that we need to really be careful with, but then also limitations of the platforms and the programming aspects that is implied by using these methods. And so collaboration with researchers is usually the best way to develop data science-driven digital audience studies. I hope I've been clear enough and you will find this content interesting. You will find the slides online on the Rainerit Digital Hub. They will be posted in the next days. And I invite you also to follow the Rainerit Digital Hub news sections for news about upcoming webinars. The next one will be in about 2 weeks, done by colleagues working in museums on cultural management for exhibitions. From my side, I thank you all for your attention and for staying until the end. And if you have any questions, please post them now in the chat. I'm happy to answer them, or get in touch via email. I'm always happy to talk about these topics. Thank you very much.